Next speaker is Deputy Keaveney.
Thank you, Catherine. Minister, in February of this year, shortly before Fianna Fáil moved a similar motion on this matter, the same matter that's in front of the House today, I met with a constituent in my office, and for the purpose of this debate, we'll call him Shane. At that time, you might think it's funny, but you're letting people gouge. You're letting the banks gouge ordinary families. And if you think it's a laughing matter that I referred to a constituent, then it's indicative of the bubble that you live in with respect to the distress families are out there with respect to the mortgage interest rate crisis that you've turned your back on. And at that time, he was enjoying a variable rate mortgage. He, his wife, had struggled through the last few years without any complaints and were paying their bills, including the ones that were levied that you promised wouldn't happen prior to 2011. They were, thankfully, and unlike many others, they stayed on top of their bills, they stayed on top of their mortgage. But the financial strain of paying this bill and other bills have, in fact, left them with nothing at all at the end of every working week. They're unable to save, they're unable to enjoy a night out, and they've not had a weekend away in the last 6 years with their family as a consequence of the ball and chain of their interest rate on their mortgage. And they are, like many other families, simply surviving in order to pay the bank. They live to pay the bank. The bank owns their life. And they're sucked into additional costs that have been imposed by this government, such as the water charges and the local property charges. And there is nothing left for these people or their family at the end of the week, as I've said. And their neighbours have enjoyed, on the same estate, falling rates over the last few years as their trackers fell in line with the ECB base rates. New neighbours in the estate who have bought at the bottom of the market are also enjoying a lower rate that's been offered to new home buyers. These families have been afforded, through interest rate cuts, lower rates. Some small financial relief has allowed them to enjoy the quality of life. However, it simply doesn't exist for the person who I referenced at the outset of my speech. See, Minister, Shane is law-abiding, he's a productive citizen. He wants nothing extraordinary, just wants a small bit of wriggle room, wants to get his financial affairs in a small bit more order, and he wants to spend some money on his children. He's horrified at the idea that for his 3 children, he's going to approach this September with the costs of up to €400 for uniforms alone for each one of those children. And here we are again in this chamber asking you to intervene like we asked you earlier on this year through a motion by Deputy Michael McGrath. And Shane's fury is as a consequence of also a knowledge that the banks are levying interest significantly greater than European norms. And his anger was not only directed at the banks, but at the political system that he believed, and clearly he believes and has seen, that you've abandoned. You've abandoned, Shane. And you've hidden behind the words of the Commission the other evening. With respect, the Commission asked you to burn bondholders, you wouldn't burn them. But if they asked you not to go and interfere with the interest rates, you certainly wouldn't. And he's incredibly cross, and I don't agree that he has any right not to be cross. And I can only imagine when we look and see the front page of today's Irish Examiner, and there are large letters on the news that was provided at Cabinet, that you backed down on the interest rates and using the European Commission to report as a convenient cover. And you declared that there was nothing more that you could do apart from just tolerate a second attempt by this party to try and do something for struggling families in this country. And the government, I think, have been equally as sensitive as the European Commission to dictate particularly of the interests of society, or even have a just approach with respect to how the financial institutions have been simply gouging families. They've been gouging them. Because Minister Noonan, regretfully, you informed the newspaper that there needs to be a market meant that the banks must be permitted to do whatever they wish, and that social concerns, they couldn't override the concerns of the bank. And that's the attitude of this government, Fine Gael, Labour, the European Commission, to use this essentially as the same as any 19th century Victorian commitment to approaching the economy. Minister Noonan's advice to variable mortgage rates offered on the front page of the Examiner is as helpful as Labour's advice to lone parents who are unable to afford childcare, that you could simply bring children to work, or you could simply just work to provide and live for a bank. Both Minister Noonan and Deputy Tuffy, who offered advice on behalf of the Labour Party, are evidently detached from the reality of families out there who are struggling to get through from one week to another, to survive, to get to Friday, to be broke on a Saturday, because they live and work for banks. They live and work and are being gouged by the banks. And Minister Noonan, you advised that variable mortgage rates were being, were being provided, as you have said this week, to best in the interest to move to the fixed rate, and observing that you believe that the bottom of the interest rate cycle, that it has happened. Considering that we are close to the zero bond, as it makes no difference, this observation is about as profound as noticing that, in fact, water is wet. Cathaoirleach, the Minister must know that the reports he receives on the banking sector, that he has offered advice, is in fact much worse with respect to how he interprets the advice he gets. He advises the mortgage holders to switch providers in order to secure better banking rates. But the switcher market is largely a mirage. The main lending banks themselves have informed the Oireachtas Finance Committee that very few of these transactions are completed. His advice that people move to fixed rates ignores the fact that existing customers are simply not being offered the fixed rates that are being offered to new customers. This is grossly unequal in the market, with existing customers being held captive by their banks on the higher rates while new customers benefit from lower rates. The government, Labour in particular, has made a great boast of being champions of equality. But when it comes to the shock that these families and the reality of these people's lives struggling to get from one week to another, it's far from equality when it comes to dealing with the banks. The bill provides an opportunity to rectify a glaring inequality that has trapped over 300,000 mortgage holders, their families, into the servitude, the prisons of the bank. It would also protect mortgage holders who have their mortgage sold onto vulture funds, of which we now try and navigate through the economy. We will also take this opportunity in this motion to ease the burden on families and to grant them some financial space so that they can participate as active citizens within their community and have some flexibility to protect the domestic circumstances and provide for their children. I fear that the latter would not maintain itself, because in defence of the European Commission, the Commission has been convenient and has given this government significant cover, and that the government and the government parties now have an exit strategy to walk away from doing what is right. And how long the deputies opposite in this House are content to sit here waiting for the cavalry of the banking competition to turn up in a year's time or 2 years' time or even 5 years' time, simply no sign of it. And how much damage would have been caused to the lives of ordinary people who are supposed to endure the expectation that the competition will enter the market and resolve the situation. It will not. Politics and legislation will resolve this situation. And it's easy for the multitude of landlords that exist in this House, Fine Gael and on the Labour benches, to be patient, because they're benefiting from the boom in the rents. But families cannot. and they're at the end of the road, they're at the end of their tolerance, and rightfully so, because the mortgage market in Ireland has failed. Intervention is needed. This bill is needed. It's a measured, moderate bill. It's simply bringing forward the equity to the mortgage market by improving the lives of over 300,000 people who deserve to have a break, to wake up not being gouged by the banks. And I appeal to the government and I appeal to the Minister to support the bill. Stand up to the Commission. You run this country. The European Commission do not. You have a chance to represent the citizenship and the interests of the citizens. Stop the banks gouging ordinary people who are struggling to get from week to week, who cannot provide for their children, whose domestic circumstances are a constant struggle. Minister, the laissez-faire approach to this will only result in more misery. Nothing will be resolved on this issue unless we have political will and, Ken Corla, political action.